Hello and welcome to this Blackwell online podcast. My name is George Miller, and my guest today is Lucy Wadham, whose latest book is a work of non-fiction, looking behind the elegant facades of France, the country which has been her home for the past 2 decades. The book, The Secret Life of France, tackles everything from sex, marriage and child-rearing to France's sense of itself in the wider world and its place in history. Many Britons envy the French for their health and education systems, their food, wine and weather, their fast, punctual trains, and an attitude to life that seems more relaxed than on this side of the Channel. So I said to Lucy it was surprising to read that France's suicide rate is over double that of the UK, and that use of antidepressants is much, much higher.
I was surprised by that myself for the reasons that you've pointed out. The quality of life does seem better. Life seems easier in France in so many ways. But I think, I sat down and tried to think about why more people kill themselves in this place. And I think the answer is not that life is harder, but more that the pain threshold is lower in France. I mean, this sounds like an incredibly sweeping statement. And in the book, I try and explain this idea in depth. But I think that a life on our quite grueling, windy island has sort of inured us to a sort of harshness in our daily lives. And we're used to sort of grappling with the struggle of existence in a way perhaps that the French are not. And I think they don't do suffering very well. And I suppose that one of the things that occurred to me when I was writing this book was why my own parents' generation, particularly my father, was so tough on the French when it came to their war record, for instance. The cliche about the French surrendering in 5 minutes. And I think that we in Britain almost have a taste for suffering and an affinity with it that the French don't have. And that in some way goes towards explaining why people give in to the temptation of antidepressants and why indeed doctors prescribe them very, very easily. I think the feeling is that we are a culture wedded to pleasure rather than duty and sacrifice, and therefore we should be allowed to make our lives pleasurable. And that means that if you are having a bad time, and if life is a struggle, perhaps you'll use antidepressants more easily.
I thought it was very interesting what you said about France and tragedy, as though they have a sort of sense of the tragic, which is in contrast to the British sense of the comic and sometimes the blackly comic, but in a way that sort of is a mechanism which helps the British to cope. But you suggest that in France, unless one's tragedy is a grand tragedy, then you sort of feel humiliated and crushed almost.
Yes, I mean the tragic register is intrinsically sort of grandiose, isn't it? It's not about drudgery, it's about suffering on a grand scale. And, if you think of French cinema and the subjects that they keep returning to, romantic suffering is a favorite, then you realize that those are the things that they do very well, and those are the subjects that they keep returning to. Their great heroes in history are people who fail on a grand scale, Joan of Arc and Napoleon, and those people are sort of, and even sort of more recently, and on a less grand scale, sort of Zidane, they love people who fail with great panache.
I mentioned at the start that education was one of the things that many British people envy in the French, and your book makes clear that comes at a price, and the French education system is very interventionist and sort of normalizing in its approach to what it produces.
It is. I put 2 children, a son and a daughter, through the French education system, and my daughter was naturally suited to it, fitted in very, very well, and responded very positively to quite a demanding, very academic program, whereas my son balked at it and struggled against it really all through his childhood. But the bizarre thing is that even though I remain quite critical of that, he, who's now in his fifth year at university doing a master's in philosophy, swears by it and feels that, his argument is that, if he hadn't had that sort of rigor, if he hadn't been bludgeoned in a way, in that way, he would have given up. And he feels that he's reaped the rewards because he was held to the task.
But I was quite struck by the fact that at nursery school level, they wanted to bring in the child psychologist because he was still drawing stick men at an age when, when he was thought of, he ought to be beyond that. And it seemed that it was very interventionist in that way, that the psychologists, the Freudian analysts were brought in at the drop of a hat, really, if a child seemed not to be meeting the attainment targets that were prescribed for it.
Yeah, but I mean, one of the things about, French society is that it is very normalizing. It's one of the paradoxes of the Republic and the idea of the Republic as having its roots in a kind of the construction of an ideal society for mankind, rather. And the legacy of that is a habit of normalization. So if, in the case of my little boy, at the age of 4, he's not drawing stick men with bodies, the school teacher, there's a system, a sort of alert system, and a light will go on, and they'll say, he's doing tadpole men, and he's 4, better look out. And this led to a whole there was a sort of ripple effect, and the school psychiatrist was called in, and they began to talk about him having masochistic tendencies, and I was appalled at this sort of interventionism and quite alarmed by it, and yet, they felt that they were, providing a service and helping me, and I struggled with that a lot. And I think the reason for that is, and particularly, the school psychiatrist is invariably Freudian, and Freud had a huge influence on French culture and society, sort of from the mid-60s, particularly after May 1968. He was sort of latched onto by the intelligentsia as having the answers to all kinds of problems. And I think that the attraction was a sort of all-consuming theory that obviously includes the libido and explains the pleasure principle. And it just fitted perfectly with, most of France's cultural tendencies, including her Catholic legacy.